2 decades. That's how long Kyle Busch spent inside one of the loudest, most unforgiving sports environments in America. 2 decades of engines screaming at 200 miles per hour. 2 decades of boos raining down from grandstands packed with people who couldn't decide whether they hated him or secretly admired him. And somehow, through all of it, Kyle Busch became something NASCAR almost never creates anymore: a true villain. Not a manufactured one, not a social media character, a real one, the kind sports only produce when talent becomes so undeniable that people start resenting it. Because for years, that was the strange relationship NASCAR fans had with Kyle Busch. They didn't just watch him, they reacted to him. Every move, every interview, every win, every smirk after climbing out of the car, especially the wins. And there were a lot of them, more than most drivers could ever dream of. But what made Kyle Busch different wasn't just the trophies, it was the feeling he created. When he showed up at a track, something changed in the atmosphere. Fans got louder, drivers got more aggressive, commentators got sharper. Because Kyle Busch had a way of making NASCAR feel personal. And for a long time, people thought they understood him. The arrogant driver, the hothead, the villain NASCAR loved to market. But the truth behind Kyle Busch's story is far more complicated than the version people saw on Sundays. Because underneath the confidence, underneath the swagger, underneath the fights, the radio explosions, the rivalries, and the controversy, was a man carrying pressure almost nobody around him fully understood. And maybe that pressure started long before the championships, long before the boos, long before he became one of the most polarizing figures the sport had ever seen. Maybe it started the moment he realized being good wasn't enough. He had to be unforgettable. And that's exactly what he became. Las Vegas, Nevada. Long before packed speedways and national television cameras, Kyle Busch was just a kid obsessed with racing. Not interested in it, obsessed with it. The kind of obsession that consumes entire families. The kind that turns weekends into road trips and childhood into preparation. By the time most kids were figuring out what hobbies they liked, Kyle Busch was already building the foundation of a professional racing career. And there was something obvious about him almost immediately: the speed. Not normal speed. Not promising young driver speed. The kind of speed that makes adults stop talking mid-sentence. The kind that creates expectations before someone is old enough to understand what expectations even are. But talent can become dangerous very quickly in professional sports. Because once people see greatness in you, they stop treating you like a normal person. Now every mistake matters more. Every failure becomes public. Every emotion becomes a headline. And Kyle Busch was emotional, very emotional. That became one of the defining themes of his career. Fans saw anger, critics saw immaturity, rivals saw arrogance. But what they were really watching was someone who cared so intensely about winning that losing physically changed him. You could see it in his face after races. You could hear it on the radio. Kyle Busch didn't know how to pretend losing was acceptable. And NASCAR fans loved that at first. Until he started winning too much. That's when everything changed. Because sports fans say they want honesty. They say they want emotion. They say they want fierce competitors. Until one athlete becomes so unapologetically competitive that he starts ruining everybody else's favorite story. And that became Kyle Busch's role in NASCAR. He ruined moments. He spoiled fairy tales. He showed up and won races people desperately wanted someone else to win. And the more successful he became, the louder the boos got. But here's what made Kyle Busch fascinating. He never really ran from it. Most athletes eventually soften themselves for public approval. They become safer, more polished, less real. Kyle Busch never fully did that, even when the criticism became overwhelming. Even when entire grandstands erupted against him during driver introductions. Even when people painted him as the villain of the entire sport. He kept leaning into competition like it was oxygen. And maybe that's because for Kyle Busch, racing was never just entertainment. It was identity. That's why some of the hardest moments of his career hit so deeply, especially 2015, because suddenly the driver who always looked indestructible looked human. A violent crash at Daytona shattered his leg and foot. In an instant, everything changed. For the first time in years, Kyle Busch wasn't fighting competitors. He was fighting uncertainty. And uncertainty is terrifying for athletes whose entire lives are built around control. Would he race again? Would he still be the same driver? Would the fear stay with him? Professional athletes almost never admit how psychologically brutal recovery can become. because the public only sees the comeback. They don't see the isolation, the frustration, the silence, the fear of becoming irrelevant while the sport keeps moving without you. And NASCAR always keeps moving. That's one of the cruelest realities of racing. The schedule never slows down long enough for emotions to catch up. But Kyle Busch came back, not carefully, not gradually. He came back furious, and what happened next became one of the most unbelievable comeback stories the sport had ever seen. He didn't just recover, he won the championship. Suddenly, the villain narrative became more complicated. Because people weren't just watching an antagonist anymore, they were watching resilience. And deep down, even fans who booed him respected that. Maybe they didn't want to admit it publicly, but they respected it. Because athletes who survive public hatred and still perform at an elite level are rare. Very rare. That kind of mental pressure destroys most people eventually. But Kyle Busch kept showing up every weekend carrying expectations, criticism, and emotional intensity that would exhaust almost anyone else. And over time, something strange happened. The villain started becoming human. Fans who once hated him started understanding him. Not completely, but enough to see the cracks beneath the armor. The husband, the father, the veteran driver realizing time moves faster than race cars do. And aging in NASCAR is psychologically brutal. Because one day you're the young, aggressive superstar everyone complains about, and the next day you're the veteran wondering how many seasons are left. That transition changes athletes emotionally, especially drivers whose identities were built around dominance. And Kyle Busch spent years dominating, wins across multiple series, championships, historic numbers, moments that permanently changed NASCAR history. But legacies in sports are strange, because numbers alone never fully explain how someone felt to watch. And Kyle Busch felt exhausting, thrilling, frustrating, electric, sometimes all at once. That's why fans reacted so strongly to him. He made people feel something. Even the people who hated him were emotionally invested. Especially them, because indifference is the real death of sports entertainment. And nobody was ever indifferent to Kyle Busch. Not during the arguments, not during the rivalries, not during the emotional radio meltdowns, not during the victories, and definitely not during the losses. Because losses always look different with him. More personal, more painful, like he carried every mistake home with him. That emotional transparency became both his greatest weakness and his greatest connection to audiences. People saw authenticity even when they didn't like it. And authenticity in modern sports has become incredibly rare, especially in an era where athletes are trained to sound careful, polished, and corporate. Kyle Busch never fully became that guy. He stayed sharp around the edges, and maybe that's why his story still matters so much to NASCAR fans, because love him or hate him, he never felt fake, not really. And in modern sports, that might be the rarest thing of all. Now, as newer generations of drivers slowly take over the spotlight, Kyle Busch's career exists in a strange emotional space. Part legend, part villain, part misunderstood competitor. The driver fans booed for years, only to eventually realize the sport felt different without him at the center of the chaos. Because every sport eventually loses its larger-than-life personalities. The athletes who made races feel emotional before engines even started, and when those personalities fade, fans usually realize something too late. Villains make sports unforgettable. Without them, everything starts feeling quieter, more predictable, less alive. That's Kyle Busch's real legacy. Not just the wins, not just the championships, not even the controversy. It's the emotion, the noise, the tension, the feeling that literally anything could happen once he put on a helmet. And maybe that's why NASCAR fans still talk about him the way they do. Because whether you cheered for him or spent years booing him from the grandstands, you remember him. You remember the feeling. And honestly, that's probably what every athlete secretly wants in the end. Not universal love, just permanence. So if you watched Kyle Busch during his prime, tell us something in the comments. Did you love him? Did you hate him? Or did you eventually realize NASCAR was more entertaining because he was in it? And where were you the first time you watched Kyle Busch race?